Christmas Eve, I talked about the fact that it's often true that when something goes wrong, something also goes right. So it is that because a baby was born in a manger, which some would say is wrong, sin has been conquered by forgiveness, and there's life in the face of death. In other words, God interrupts that which is wrong in order to transform it or to rearrange it so that right also occurs. Well, it's not hard to figure out what's wrong in today's gospel lesson. In fact, we would be inclined to say it's wrong, wrong, wrong. But I'll get to that specific detail in a minute. We read that Joseph has been warned in a dream that there are those who are seeking to kill Jesus. And so he takes Mary and the baby and goes to Egypt, where they are safely in hiding until Herod dies. Now, I think most of us know the story. The they in this story is the wise men, the Magi, who have come to honor the King of the Jews. That's quoting their own request. And of course, they made the request for the King of the Jews when they stopped at the palace, which where else would one stop if one was looking for a baby who had been born King of the Jews? Unfortunately, Herod was threatened by their quest. And so King Herod asked the wise men to return after they found the baby and tell him where and who the child was. Much to Herod's, I don't know, where's that one? Disconcertedness is what I was trying to say. I don't think that's quite the word, though. Herod was very upset. In fact, I think it says in the text he was furious because the wise men didn't come back. They too had a dream, and they went home by another way. And so Herod decides to solve the problem by ordering the murder of all baby boys aged 2 and under who had been born in and around Bethlehem. In the church, it's called the slaughter of the holy innocents. Even the title makes us uncomfortable. It's wrong, 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 wrong. And we especially don't want to hear it on the 5th day of the Christmas season. After all, if things are going to be calm and bright, we might as well take down the decorations, stop singing the Christmas carols, and get back to normal. Right? I mean, we don't come to church expecting to hear this kind of a story on the Sunday after Christmas, do we? We don't want things to get back to normal quite yet. But maybe Mary and Joseph did. At least that's what one commentator said. You know, their lives had been in turmoil. They had an unexpected pregnancy. They ended up having to relocate to Bethlehem because of taxes. They welcomed their firstborn in a barn of all places. And then these unusual visitors came, the humble shepherds and the very exotic magi. And now we can imagine after all of this has happened, they just want to get back to normal. But the problem is that the birth of this baby has brought a new normal to their lives and to the world. And one of the things that is the new normal is that God communicates to Joseph in dreams. And Joseph pays attention. So, while there are wails and laments from around Bethlehem, the Holy Family is safe in Egypt. I have to tell you, I find that to be a little disconcerting. It is, I suppose, what is right in the story, although there's nothing that's really right about the deaths of all those little boys. And so it reminds us of something that is not new, which is that the arrival of Jesus does not rid the world of the pain and suffering that is caused by human choice. And in fact, I believe that God is shaking God's head right along with us. But the question is not why. The question is what? In the midst of the pain and suffering that is the result of human choice, in this case the result of Herod's choice to be threatened so that he murders all of these innocent children. In the midst of human choice, we ask ourselves, what can we do in order to make it known that God's grace and God's presence is among us? In other words, how can we interrupt the wrong of the world with that which is right? Recently, I finished reading a new book by Anne Lamott. It's called Stitches. And in it she tells this story. It's true. There was a fire about 15 years ago near where she lives in California. And this fire was started because 4 older teenage boys had gone into the mountains and camped illegally and had started a campfire illegally. And when they left, they buried, they put dirt over the embers of the fire, not knowing that those burning coals could still be very dangerous. And that fire caused the destruction of 12,000 acres and 50 homes. The town was saved because they somehow used helicopters to bring water from the bay to douse the fire before it completely destroyed the town. But she writes that the loss of wildlife was overwhelming. Birds, coyotes, deer, bobcats, it was as if a bomb had gone off. Well, a few weeks after this devastating fire, someone wrote the San Francisco Chronicle, someone who lived in the town where the fire had occurred. And that person was praising the firefighters, was talking about how the town had worked so hard to save whatever they could, and of course talked about the generosity of people that so often happens when there's a natural or human-made disaster. And then the writer quoted another letter, a letter that had been in the hometown newspaper. And that letter had been written by one of the firefighters. That firefighter talked about the fact that these 4 boys had come forward immediately, and that they had done what they knew to do to put out the fire, but they had no idea of the danger that was still there. And after his letter, an interesting thing happened. People in the town, as they supported each other, people who had lost their homes, people who had lost their businesses, people who were overwhelmed by the loss of that 12,000 acres, began to talk about their own teenage failures and about the mistakes they had made when they were young. And then there was a picnic to honor the firefighters. And the president of the firefighters board spoke, but he sort of got off the topic and he started to talk about how in ancient times if people did anything to damage a city, they were forced to go live outside of the city walls. And he said, I don't want that to happen in our community. I've heard that the families of these 4 young men are thinking of moving because they so regret what happened because of their lack of knowledge about fires. And we don't want that to happen. We need to go to these families, and we need to tell them that they're wanted and they're needed. Now think about that. These 4 boys, now admittedly, not purposely, started a fire that destroyed 50 homes and 12,000 acres. Their families are thinking of moving away because they're so embarrassed and upset about what has happened, and they don't want there to be negative consequences in their sons' lives. And the firefighter president is saying, we don't want them to do that. We want them to know that they're wanted and needed. After his speech, people came up and said, yes, that's what we need to do. We need to let these families know that we want them to stay. People who lost their homes, we want them to stay. And so the letter writer sums up his comments by saying, and so it is in a town that experienced a Holocaust and that was fighting to save itself, has switched now to saving the futures of 4 young men. That's what the new normal looks like. It's when people, in spite of their own pain and potential resentment, focus beyond themselves for the well-being of others. That's what it's like. That's a great example of how the right can interrupt the wrong, of how God's grace and how God's presence can be made known in the midst of all that's wrong in the world. That's the new normal that Jesus brought and taught. But in today's gospel lesson, there's a hint at what I call the big picture new normal. I don't know if you're like me, but when I was a little kid, I always got this story that we read today mixed up with another story. I knew that there was a story in the New Testament at the time of Jesus' birth about a tyrant who ordered the deaths of babies. But I got it mixed up with a similar story that's in the Old Testament. Does anyone know which one it is? Right. The Pharaoh in the Old Testament ordered the deaths of baby boys born to Hebrew slaves. And because of that, one Hebrew mother, remember the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, one Hebrew mother put her son in a basket and put him in the reeds, where he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. What's that guy's name? Anybody know? Moses. And so Moses was delivered from the wrath of the Pharaoh to become the deliverer of the people of Israel, delivering them from slavery in Egypt. In the same way, Jesus was delivered from the wrath of Herod by being kept safe in all places, Egypt, so that he could deliver humanity from slavery to sin and death. That's the big picture. The message is that ultimately, the power and love of God will triumph over evil. And that's the new normal. It impacts how we live in this world, and it impacts us eternally. And that's what we celebrate on this 5th day of Christmas. So I guess we don't have to take down Christmas decorations yet.